Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Henson. I am a Blue Coat at Science North, and I am super excited to be opening a brand new season of Let's Talk COVID-19. So this is a series that we wanted to have to engage people in talking about COVID-19, the pandemic, and some of the issues that we see in science and some of the issues that we see coming up in the future over the next little while. So we're really excited to have you here today. This is a great partnership between Science North in Sudbury, Ontario, and Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. We're bringing you experts in their field to come and join us and to talk about these issues. Now, today, we're talking all about flu and the interaction between flu and COVID-19. So I'm really, really excited to have everybody join in today. But first, what I would love to do is I want to introduce Dr. David Marsh from Laurentian University and the Northern Ontario School of Medicine. He's going to come on to welcome us from our partner, Laurentian University, this morning.
Good morning. Thanks, Amy. Bienvenue, Annie, Kwekwe, Wache. It gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to this event today. To begin with, we'd like to acknowledge the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We also further recognize that Laurentian University is located on the traditional lands of the Atikameksheng and Anishinaabeg, and that the greater city of Sudbury also includes the traditional lands of Wenapete First Nation. Despite the challenges we're all facing, isn't it incredible how technology has brought us together in a way that we would not have imagined? In my role as the Associate Dean of Research, Innovation, and International Relations at the Northern Ontario School of Medicine, I've seen firsthand the engagement and willingness of our exceptionally talented researchers to support the fight against COVID-19. I now will turn things back over to Amy, who will guide us through the next hour.
Great. Thank you very, very much. It's so wonderful to have you. And we are so pleased to have Laurentian University and Science North together in this partnership, because we know that across the world, research is happening right now where it comes with COVID-19. It's really, really important that we all engage as a larger scientific community to help solve our world's problems. And that research is also happening at just down the road from Science North and different places all over the world. So we're super excited to have Laurentian partnership here today. Now, we have some amazing researchers who are going to come on to talk to us. And I really want to frame this conversation, though, about what we mean when we're having this discussion. This is an open discussion. So if you're watching on YouTube or you're watching on Facebook, whether it's through Science North or through Laurentian University channels, wherever you're watching today, you can put comments and questions into the comment feed below, wherever you're watching. Please feel free to answer questions. If you're watching this in your classroom, you can have your teacher type in those questions, whatever it happens to be. And please ask questions of our panelists today. They are here to just open up and have a great conversation with us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panelists. We've brought in two amazing panelists from Laurentian today. So first up, we have Dr. Dave McLean. He is a professor of physiology. And then second up, we have Megan McHugh. She is a PhD candidate at Laurentian. So welcome. How are you guys today?
Good. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. I love these kinds of interactive discussions, particularly when I'm able to reach out to young students and maybe not only be informative, but also perhaps encourage them to life in science.
Absolutely. And I'm all for a life in science. That's for sure. Megan, do you want to introduce yourself a little?
Yeah, so I'm a PhD student at Laurentian University. I work with Dave. My research kind of focuses on exercise and how we can utilize that to treat chronic disease and prevent disease. I'm very happy to be here because I'm a Sudbury native, so happy to be talking to some Sudbury schools. I went to Lockerbie. I know we have a Lockerbie class today, so very excited to be chatting to you guys.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So I want to kind of frame our discussion a little bit, because when we were sort of thinking of what are the issues that were surrounding with COVID, one of the things that we know right now is that we are in not only a pandemic season, but we're also in a flu season. And so we've got this sort of ebb and flow of how viruses, move. We see numbers going up with COVID. We know that this is the time of year that people do get the flu virus as well. And we really want to talk today about this interaction between flu and COVID and how viruses do, ebb and flow and throughout the population. So I'm wondering if maybe somebody wants to talk a little bit about for us is, why do viruses do this to begin with? Why is there ebb and flow? Why did we see fewer cases of COVID in the summer and now it's larger? And now we're also expecting perhaps larger flu numbers. It's all, I'm curious as to why that happens.
Yeah, sure. I can begin that discussion. Thanks. That's a great question. So we do know that many viruses are seasonal. Flu is an extremely good example of that. And what we mean by that is it tends to be higher, in the fall and the winter. When you look at the numbers that are tracked globally every year, depending on whether in the southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere. For us, being in the northern hemisphere, we tend to see flu season begin in October, around that time, and peaks in February, and usually ends towards the end of March. And there's specific reasons why we have that. The flu virus, the influenza, it's not a coronavirus, it's an influenza virus. Been around for a long, long time. And we just happen to know that through a lot of research and years and years and years of interaction that virus thrives better actually in cold climates. So there's a number of reasons. First off, that the virus tends to like cooler temperatures, and it actually likes it when it's less humid. Studies have shown that, in fact, the same influenza virus in a humid, arid environment, say of around, this is U.S. numbers from the studies out of the U.S., but in about 95 plus degrees, lasts a long time. You reduce that down to about 40 degrees and reduce the humidity to last for an hour on a surface. So its lifespan, or its ability to infect people, is much, much lower in hot and humid temperatures as compared to cold ones. And what we find in the winter, of course, is a number of other factors. And is first off, what I mentioned in terms of the environment, but most people huddle indoors. And so you're rebreathing the same air, and as a result, you are also increasing your chances for infection. And thirdly, along that, and we'll probably get to this at some point, is that we don't treat the flu like we treat COVID-19. We don't tell people to go isolate. You get the flu, you ride it out, and that's it. We do know people with the flu will go to the grocery store and will go and interact with other ones. And if a loved one in your family has a flu, you're constantly going in, touching their forehead to make sure that they are hot or not, and these sorts of things. So we just don't treat the flu from an infectious perspective to the same way that we treat COVID-19. So why is COVID-19 ebb and flow? Well, despite the fact that there are going to be a number of claims that the flu is going to COVID-19 was going to miraculously go away in the summer, that never manifested. It is considerably more contagious, and although basically the route of transmission are fairly similar, it's much more virulent, and as a result, we don't really see these ebbs and flows with this particular virus. Now, just to note, we've really only known this virus since December 31st, 2019, when it was first identified in China. And for those who are interested, it's COVID-19, not because it's the 19th virus, it's because it was discovered in 2019. So that's where the name comes from. But since we don't have a ton of information on it yet, and a lot of studies have been done, but these are really looking at large populations that have been infected. It's really a result of interaction and the degree of spreading, and it doesn't seem to be as influenced as much by the environmental conditions.
Oh yeah, it's interesting looking back when you think of, in December, just under a year ago, this virus didn't really exist to our knowledge, and how much it's completely changed our lives over the past little while. And maybe, David, maybe I'll get you to do, could you talk about what you mean when you say it's less, or it's more virulent? Like, what does that actually mean?
Okay, so what we know is that in general terms, studies, because we have historical data on the flu, So the numbers, for example, are that, you know, every year, quite a few people get the flu. And some get tested for it, and that's how we kind of know the numbers. People get the flu, don't tell people, they write it out. So how would our national flu reporting center know about it? But we actually have people who come in and get tested for the different types of influenza. So we have an idea of basically somewhat what the transmission rates are based on laboratory testing. And we find that, in fact, under normal circumstances, a great deal of the population may become infected, but quite less die. So it's lethality or how fatal it is considerably less. And the numbers that have come out of southern hemispheres as well as the northern hemispheres, and there's a lot of factors in here, such as individuality, age group, comorbidities, a bunch of different variables go into it. But in general terms, the literature tends to show that the lethality of the flu is about from between 0.1 and 1%. And then with right now globally we're finding a death rate with COVID-19 is around 3.4, but say between 3 and 4%. So really, when you hear numbers that COVID-19 is 10 times more deadly, it is, and it could even be more. So that's what I mean. It's actually much more. Its ability to cause severe symptoms and its ability to cause death are much greater than that of the flu, and that's what I mean.
And so right now we're in this season, right, where the flu is coming out potentially, right? Everybody is getting their flu shots. It's that time of year, and then all of a sudden too, we've got COVID in this mix. So I always kind of wonder, like, if I'm a person, can I get both viruses at the same time? Like, how would that work?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. Absolutely, you are susceptible to getting both. So I think when we look back, and I'll preface this answer by saying, if you remember a lot of the media coverage that occurred back early in the spring, they were worried about the second wave and the flu season coming in at the same time. I think that's why we're here today. We're talking a little bit about what those possible interactions could have been or would have been or are. And so the reason for that is that you can easily get one or the other, and you can have both. Now, early, what the studies so far have found is that actually getting both is actually fairly rare. In fact, the first time it came out of China after it hit on about, I think it was only the first 500 people, showed that a very, very low percentage it was very, very rare. And then when it struck in New York, we all recall, they did a quick analysis of about 2,000 patients. There's 1,996 actually total. But they found that only of those, only one person also had COVID, the flu. But what we cannot forget is that that's just the flu. There are other respiratory viruses and other respiratory conditions that you can also get along with COVID that really causes that to be worse. And so that's what they look at as well. So yes, we can get it. Yes, they're two completely different viruses. And at some point, maybe we can talk a little bit about why that's important to differentiate between the two and why this is happening. But you need to remember that a flu shot will not protect you against the COVID-19. We need a separate vaccine for that. And in fact, what we find is that really your instance of getting the flu and COVID-19 are really quite low, but it can happen. And if it does happen and you do have both, they tend to find studies that have looked at people that do have them both and they do survive. Their hospital stays, because that tends to be more severe, is lengthened by about 5 to 6 days.
Right.
So, Megan, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, that pretty much sums it up.
That's good.
You can get both, but it's pretty rare that you'll get both, and you'd have to be doing some non-socially distanced activities probably to acquire both the flu and COVID at the same time. So probably doing something you shouldn't be doing.
Well, David brought in a really good point though about health and well-being as a whole, right? So if you have any type of, other respiratory issues or pre-existing conditions, right, they can factor into the severity of either of these viruses, right? So whether you get the flu or whether you or COVID, like either of these, right, that can be affected by your general health and your general well-being. I don't know, Megan, do you want to talk a little bit about, your patients' previous health and how important that is in those factors?
Yeah, for sure. So with COVID, we're seeing that a lot of our higher risk patients and those who are presenting with more severe cases or having a bit of a tougher time recovering from it tend to fall into an elderly category, or they have pre-existing medical conditions, whether that's cardiovascular, metabolic. It's a wide range of issues, or perhaps they're on immunosuppressants or undergoing treatment for various diseases or conditions. Chemotherapy can really wear down your immune system. So if you're already at a state where your immune system isn't firing on all cylinders and it's kind of struggling to deal with you at baseline, if you introduce an infection to that, the tipping point to severity becomes a lot sooner. So you'll reach that point of overwhelming your body and overwhelming your immune system, causing crazy inflammation, and your body will just not really be able to handle all of the stimulus and all the crazy stuff that's happening. So it'll start to shut down, and it might not react in the same way that someone who's healthy and 20 might react. So if you have a good immune system and you're otherwise healthy, you'll probably have a fairly good chance at battling the virus. But again, what we're seeing is that it's not a hard and fast rule that if you're old, you'll have a hard time with it, and if you're young, you'll have an easy time, because we're seeing a lot of patients who are 30, 40, even in their 20s, who are being hospitalized and potentially having very severe and fatal cases of COVID. So it's important to know that the best way to avoid any of these problems and avoid severe symptoms is to avoid getting the infection in the first place.
That is pretty good advice. So we actually had a question come in about, has anybody ever looked at yet anyway about the coronavirus, and it's we going kind of back to our original part, and it's survivability in a freezing temperature environment. So if we're, we're in Canada right now, and it's minus 8 degrees outside this morning. So
yeah, thanks. A lot of studies have examined in what we call in laboratory situations the survivability of that on surfaces. And you may have seen some of the data that has come out from those studies showing that, how long it'll last on wood and steel and doorknobs and these sorts of things. And those numbers vary based on the surface and its temperature and some of its other qualities. In terms of freezing temperatures, viruses can survive in cold and they can survive in warm. They don't necessarily die off like throwing them in a freezer. They don't really react necessarily that way, but their ability to be transmitted or their ability to function may be decreased in really severe temperature differences. And not a lot of studies have focused on that right now. And I think one of those reasons is a lot of studies are really focusing on what can we do now. I'm sure some of those follow-up studies, once this pandemic has been saddled and we're able to move forward, I'm sure there'll be lots of other studies done to try and better understand how it behaves in different environments, how it behaves in different conditions, and how it behaves and so forth. So we'll just really have to wait and see on that, but it's a good question.
Yeah. And we've seen sort of different, when we look at this on a global scale, and it's always harder to sort of think of it on a global scale when you're dealing with it at home in your community as well. But, we've had huge numbers of cases in warm environments like Brazil and Arizona. And now, just recently in the news, they're talking about cases are finally hit Canada's north in Nunavut. So, I sort of think it's interesting at the beginning of this pandemic, a lot of people were talking about how, it'll be fine in the summer, it'll go away because the heat will kill it, but that just doesn't really seem to be the case, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think this might be a good segue into some important concepts that maybe make our listeners understand how this virus works a little bit. Is that really it's the transmission of the virus that it causes you to become infected. So, and you brought up Nunavut and so forth, is that what we know and what's really been well established in studies and within the literature is that we know that it's basically transmitted through droplets that occur from coughing and sneezing, and then they land and you get them, and then they need to be in contact with some of your mucosal membranes. And then, of course, that's how you can become infected. That's why mask wearing and hand washing and social distancing and these sorts of things are incredibly important. They're simple, they're easy, and they work. And they work incredibly well. So I think one thing to remember is that we, even in cold climates, we go indoors. So if you actually are infected and then you go indoors and there's a large group of people there, or you have a large number of family just coming in from the cold into a cold environment, you're gonna and you are shedding the virus, which means you're infected, will allow others to become infected as well. And excuse me. What's really interesting is that we don't really realize this, for all of you out there, is that our studies have been done on how many times you touch your face a day. Okay? Yeah. And I'm terrible at it.
I touch mine all the time. It's awful.
Yeah. And so depending on the age group, children versus adults versus activities, but in general terms, you know, we touch our face between 20 and 30 times an hour.
Easy.
Okay? And really, of those, they've estimated between 40 and 50% of the time you're touching a mucosal membrane, breathing your mouth, your nose, your eyes. And so really about 10 times an hour, you're potentially infecting yourself because you're touching something you shouldn't. We just do it by habit. I mean, people bite their nail. I mean, there's highs and lows in everybody. So as much as we can do when we talk about different environments, we are still doing things. That's why the best thing to do is frequent hand washing. And if you've been to, like, I have a certain procedures I do when I go out to Walmart to get groceries, or I go somewhere, I have a sanitization system in my car. And then when I get home, I immediately wash my hands before I touch anything else. You know, you need to practice these kinds of guidelines. And when detergent is the best killer of the virus, because it causes that cell to disrupt and it can't be functional. And so those are the sorts of things that if we follow really proper health guidelines, really diminishes the ability for it to spread. But if you are contagious, and the issue is with the flu, if you're exposed to someone with the flu, traditionally you will show symptoms between 1 and 4 days. It's very quick. We say the flu runs, COVID walks. So what happens is that the flu, when you're exposed, you can get symptoms the next day. It can happen very quickly, and you can be contagious for up to 4 to 7 days while you're ill, and then it resolves. With COVID-19, studies are really basically indicating that you can not show symptoms for up to 2 to 3 days, or sorry, you should just say, rephrase that. Once exposed, the median for you showing symptoms is about 5 days.
Wow.
But once infected, you can be transmitting to others 2 days prior to showing symptoms. So a lot of that asymptomatic component is that I could be infected and not know it, and it's Monday, I'm going to get my symptoms on Thursday, but Tuesday and Wednesday, I could be spreading it to everybody without knowing it. And so the fact that it has a lower, what we'll call incubation rate, but a higher ability to infect, kind of makes it the perfect storm in some degrees. It's a little slower. So we don't know we're ill until a little bit later. And that's where that whole hand touching and all that stuff can come in terms of other things, because we don't really know that we're infected yet.
Right.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think too, that sort of longer incubation period with COVID is a large justification for why we have these social distancing rules and also maintaining smaller social circles. Because if you consider you have 5 days until you're showing symptoms of infection, for those 5 days prior, if you're not aware of who you're interacting with and where you're going and trying to limit unnecessary outings, think of the number of people you could interact with or, pass by in the store or in a classroom or at work, the number of people that you interact with is probably far greater than you would ever imagine it to be. And if you're not showing symptoms for those 5 days, you're certainly not going to be as careful either. So that vector can just shoot through the roof. And that's why we're seeing these crazy rates of spread, especially in these smaller circles or small gatherings that people are mingling closely. And it's not your fault if you don't know you have it, but that is certainly the justification for limiting your social gatherings and limiting numbers at parties and what have you.
Yeah. Well, and that's why we all have different backgrounds today, because we're all socially distancing. You're not in my circle, Megan, so we have to.
No thanks.
We have to be separate. I just want to remind our audience, though, if you're watching on YouTube and you're watching on Facebook, you can add questions, you can add comments into the chat below, and those comments will be filtered into our speakers and to me, so I can ask your question for you. So you can type stuff in there, and we are going to get it. So you can go ahead and type those in. Now, David, you were mentioning, and I think this is kind of neat, is that, the best thing to kill viruses, like whether it's flu or whatever, is a detergent, right? So washing your hands with soap, which I think is so, I think this is a new generation of doing hand sanitizer all the time. And when, COVID first started too, there was a run on soap. It's like nobody had soap at their house or something, like you couldn't find soap anywhere. But tell me why, in terms of the actual makeup of a virus, why soap is so effective.
Yeah, sure. It's actually very simple. And I may be really dating myself here, but I don't know if you guys ever remember Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Yeah, he's my hero.
Yeah. He actually has an interesting YouTube video about why detergents kill viruses. He really demonstrates in a bath with soap, and it's actually kind of cool. But so feel free to kind of Google that and look it up. But cool. The simplest thing is that the virus has a cell membrane. It's a cell, and what happens is detergents on surfaces like your hands, when it touches that's why they call it a detergent, and we use it in in the lab quite a lot for dismantling certain things. We have certain products that we use that function in the same theoretical way, and that is that it disrupts its membrane. So it basically breaks the cell open, and then once you do that, the cell is broken and it can't function. So detergents are remarkably good at breaking that cell membrane and then rendering that cell non-functional.
Interesting. So it is such a simple thing, right? Like you think of, it's been around for everywhere, but such a just a effective tool, right? I don't know. To me, that's amazing. I don't know. I sort of think of it like it's such a simple tool that I've had in my bathroom forever, right? So
well, absolutely, and it's amazing when you look at honestly, folks, and this is what. I mean, I'm sure we're all tuned into how bad the U.S. is, and it's really tragic for them. And this massive misinformation and things is killing people. And really, simply, masks, social distancing, and hand washing works. And we proved that when we first happened, and we practiced those guidelines, and we were able to blunt and the curve in our first wave. And so, there's so many really good, hardcore scientific studies demonstrating this, and really just following those guidelines and keeping yourself and others safe like that really is the way to help prevent this until such time as we have a widespread vaccine that's available.
Right. So we've been doing all these things, and I know there's this exhaustion factor out there with people right now. It's like, yes, I'm tired of social distancing. I want to go hang out with my friends and everything like that. But I'm still all about washing my hands, because you should always wash your hands regardless of whether we're in a pandemic or not. But I guess so there's this interesting change of attitude that people have had with the virus, right? Is that with this pandemic, is that we are a little bit more careful. We are a little bit more aware. People have changed their behavior, especially early on in this pandemic, right? And I'm curious as to when we go back and talk about flu season and how people haven't really thought of flu as like kind of a big deal. We kind of got in and used to it. Are we seeing differences in how flu is being spread early on in the flu season?
Okay, actually, I think it's really a good question. And I don't know if anybody watched the news last night, but they actually talked about the fact that we're having a very blunted flu season. And that's not surprising. So I think a little bit of background might be worthwhile here. And so typically we do have these flu seasons. And we tend to look at our southern hemisphere countries such as Australia and Brazil and other countries like that with large populations that suffer from flu as well in a number of different ways. We use it as a bit of a metric, a meter stick to see how severe that season may be. They, of course, kind of basically have to guess what strain to get the vaccine for because the virus mutates so much. And so we know that it's coming. And what we find is that early on with COVID, when people were utilizing proper health guidelines, just like we said, that they were not having the same degree of flu. And really there are a number of reasons for that. And so in Canada, for example, the National Flu Report, some of the crazy things I read, just shown that for the first week in November, we did not have one hospitalized case of influenza in any province or territory. And what we had 60 at this time last year.
Wow.
And overall, for the first week, we had 711 confirmed cases, that's laboratory confirmed cases of influenza. And usually get those when it's severe enough that you have to go in and get checked for it. We only had 17 cases. And we've done twice as many tests. And we usually test about 4,500 times. We've tested 10,000.
Mm-hmm.
So what's that showing? Well, what they did was some studies that have been done in China, the US, and others have all shown exactly the same thing, that their flu season in some areas have been blunted up to 98%. Yeah, it's phenomenally how much lower it is. And they're really attributing that to people's conscientious coherence to the public health guidelines. So that is basically it's hand washing, socially distancing, wearing masks, and fourth, and what one people don't really recognize is a decrease in international travel.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's true, right?
Yeah, and it's really amazing how much of our everything, you get the flu, you hop on a plane, you're going and wherever, and then you're spreading it all over. And it's the same thing. And so, that whole change in our travel behavior has also influenced and contributed to these lower numbers.
Right.
So we are, and the fear was, of course, that when you get two viruses with similar symptoms to a certain degree and can cause severe reactions in some populations. And it's a little different for the flu than it is for COVID-19. But regardless, they are kind of classified as respiratory diseases and areas. So the real worry was that if we had a very virulent flu season on top of COVID-19, that would cause a real strain on our health delivery resources like hospital beds and respirators and things like that. And so I'm really pleased that, in fact, I think that they anticipated this, so we're ahead of the game in terms of making sure that we have enough resources to handle such a thing. But in fact, the second part thus far, and we're only, into November, because like I say, the peak tends to be in northern climates around February. But so far that we've been able, through these measures, to be able to really blunt the number of cases we're seeing so far.
Right. I remember I was traveling in late January of this past year, and I flew into Arizona, and it was all fine and whatever. And then I flew home, And all of a sudden I got to Pearson Airport in Toronto, and I couldn't figure out why they were herding me into this very strange area of the airport. And I hadn't been paying attention to news or anything. And I had to call my husband, and I was like, hey, like, what's going on? He's like, oh, there's this virus that's out there. And I was like, oh, I see what they're doing. They're trying to separate travelers from international travelers versus North American travelers, et cetera. And travel is actually kind of an interesting kind of point. And we had just a question come in about travel a little bit. And the question was asking, if we've seen an increase of people from different, a red zone or orange zones, like coming up to, green or yellow zones, like here in Sudbury. But I think it's really important to talk about too is the idea of, traveling from zone to zone. If you're living in what we'll call in Ontario, a red zone, right? One that has, high rates of infection or higher rates of infection versus a lower zone, and the risk that can happen from that when people are traveling.
Yeah, great question. There is no doubt that if you go from a green zone to a red zone, there's a reason why it's a green zone, there's a reason why it's a red zone. So there's no doubt that traveling to an area that is in an area where the infection rate is considerably higher, increase your risks. Now you can mitigate those risks by following proper guidelines if you have to. I mean, the key thing here is that don't travel to those zones unless it's 100% necessary. If you just want to go down and visit friends and go out and see a movie, or even if you can do that, it's not behavior that really you want to do. So have they looked at that? So what they have found, and you got to remember that public health has a number of different mandates they have to abide by, and one is protectionism of people's information and certain things like that. So they have to talk somewhat in generalities. So when you hear the public health report that we have X number of new cases, and contact tracing has indicated the fact that these are all related to travel. So they don't really tell you anything more than that. But word gets out and people talk and things like that. And there's no doubt that some of the cases that occur will be related to those who have gone to other areas and become infected, because when they're related to travel, you've got it because you travel. And since travel is somewhat restricted, you can kind of deduce that they've probably been in a place where the infection rate was higher, and as a result, they happened to get that. So, and we're finding provinces responding to this differently. Early in the virus, several provinces actually shut down inter-province travel. You couldn't. If you went into a province, you still had to quarantine for 14 days and things to that effect. So, even the East Coast is handling things, and now we have Manitoba. There's all these sorts of things. So each province really is trying to do what's best for them based on where their clusters are.
Yeah.
So certainly, please be aware of the fact that yes, within Ontario, travel within Ontario is not restricted. But if you happen to be traveling into, through, or have to through a red zone, I think you really have to be extremely diligent in ensuring that you protect yourself, because you have the potential, a greater potential of perhaps bringing that back to a green zone.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting, right? We can think of it kind of two ways, of people traveling from a red zone to a green zone and back, or, you think you're perfectly safe living in a green or yellow zone and traveling somewhere else where the virus is a little bit higher, and then coming back and bringing it back to your own community, right? So there's kind of two different ways to look at that. Absolutely. The last thing I want to kind of touch on, which I think when I think of viruses, is I really want to touch on this idea of virus mutations. And David, earlier on, you told me a little bit about how every infected person is a vector to be a virus, and the possibility for that virus to mutate. Can you talk to us a little bit about mutations in viruses and what we've seen or what we might expect, or do we really even know what could happen with a viral mutation from COVID-19?
Sure. So mutations is basically just an internal change within the cell, which can have a number of different effects. A large mutation can actually end up being fatal to the virus, to the cell, and destroying it, and that's not a good mutation. But viruses, like any other living organism, it's not living, but any other kind of thing, it's self-survival. So they can have small mutations, which just change something very minor, which would not necessarily change the symptoms you get or the severity of it, but it really has changed it. So we do know, for example, that the strain, and that's why we have flu strains. It's a flu, but we have different strains due to the fact that something has changed within that strain to make it a little bit different. So it may not respond to the same vaccine. And that's really one of the biggest issues with the mutating of various different things, is that it really hinders our ability to treat it. And we can treat viruses through what's called antiviral medications. So that those medications are designed to attack the viral cell and kill it while not killing the host cell that's infecting it. So it's a real fine balance there. All it takes is a very small mutation within that virus. It may not change the way it manifests itself in a host in terms of symptoms and severity, but it renders the antivirals completely useless. So mutations are just a normal part of how viruses work. If they did mutate and we could treat them all, we may have eradicated quite a few, but we don't have that luxury. And what happens is, because viruses are basically strands of information that code for other information that makes proteins, that makes it replicates itself, every time that happens, there's a chance during that process that it can be mutated. And there's a really, really well respected persons out of Johns Hopkins, for example, that are researchers, and we're talking about this exact same type of idea. And basically they equated it to the fact that, every time a person becomes infected, that's a roll of the dice, whether or not that new person becomes infected. When that cell enters and begins its process of replicating, will it mutate? So when you look at the number of people who are infected worldwide, and in the U.S. now, I think it's 11 million. And that's 11 million rolls of the dice that could happen.
If I was in Vegas, I wouldn't like those odds.
Yeah. So you have to recognize that not all mutations result in us being effective in treating it. Not all mutations result in a more lethal type of strain. The key thing to remember about viruses is that if they are so lethal that it kills the host before it can replicate, it's going to die off.
Right.
So you want, and that's why I think the flu is so prevalent, is that it has a very low mortality rate, has a fairly decent infection rate, and because of that, it can survive. Whereas you have other types of viruses that we know of that are very fatal very quickly, and there, of course, will end up dying off very quickly. So these mutations are just the way the virus adapts and changes and things to that effect, but it's a part of something that we always have to take into consideration. And that's why I think these new vaccines that are coming out and so forth, and why sometimes the vaccines that are designed now kind of attack the virus in a slightly different way, are trying to do away with the fact that you may get a mutation, but we don't want it to affect the way that we treat it. Right.
And that's the challenge for scientists right now and researchers right now in that development.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at, I'm cautiously optimistic with what I've been reading, particularly with regards to the vaccines that are coming out. Historically, it takes about a decade to produce a vaccine and go through all the different phase trials and then have it approved and then be able to distribute it. The quickest we ever were able to develop a vaccine was about 4 years, and that was the measles. And as a result, what we've seen right now isn't really good. I mean, a lot of this stuff was developed back 40 years ago, so our technology is much better now.
Mm-hmm.
Our processes and abilities to do it is much better, so they can do that. I am very impressed with the numbers I'm seeing, but again, caution, and you'll be hearing this from the experts as well, that we need to still do our due diligence and make sure that these are safe, because we have no historical data for them, right? We have no idea what the long-term effects of COVID are. We have no idea how long a vaccine will last. We have no idea how long natural immunity, after you have it, lasts, although they're now saying it could only be up to about 4 months. 3 to 4 months. So people have gotten COVID twice. There have been a number of cases reported of that. So we need to be a little cautious, but I'm very optimistic, and that's really how we're going to do it. Because I would like to, if you don't have any questions, there is a concept that's in that about herd immunity that I think I'd like to talk a little bit about, because
Sure. Yeah.
Well, the reason I want to bring it up is that it's been in the news a lot, and you really have to understand that process because it's used completely erroneously in the media. And I want people to be careful when they think, and I think it's part of that erroneous idea of herd immunity that's causing a number of different problems in various different areas around the world. Because the way herd immunity is being described in a lot of media outlets is that if you have 1 million people and you just infect all 1 million people, then eventually, and you are willing to suffer the consequences that 10% will die, okay, then at the end of that infection cycle, everybody will be immune. You've got herd immunity. That's not what herd immunity is. It's absolutely wrong. It's unethical. It doesn't work. And the reason being is herd immunity is actually only achieved through vaccination. That's where that term comes from. It's used in vaccine circles as a term, and it's only achievable through vaccination. And that's why you hear the real experts, if you ever listen to Fauci from NIH and others, talk about herd immunity and why they're just shaking their heads, is that vaccines work and herd immunity is achieved through the combination of both. Because what happens is that if you have 1 million people, let's say 10% can't get the vaccine. And there's reasons why people can't get vaccinated, and I won't go into all of them, but there is a percentage of the population for various different reasons that will not get vaccinated. They're still susceptible to that disease. Mm-hmm. Okay? If you get the other 90% vaccinated, they're no longer going to be able to transmit to those other 10%. So you get herd immunity through the vaccination, and then the inability to spread that to those who could not get vaccinated. So they're protected. Mm-hmm. And for example, when the polio epidemic was around, the vaccine for that, you had to vaccinate 70% or 80% of the population to achieve that immunity level. Measles, it's 95%. So there are statistics that, and this is only achievable through collecting data over time, that's only achievable if you do the vaccine and then allow that vaccine to protect those who cannot be vaccinated. Because the problem with this other concept of herd immunity, which is absurd, is that, okay, you infect 1 million people, 10% die, and then that immunity lasts. Everybody's not going to get it exactly the same time. Let's say if your immunity to that only lasts 3 months, then the cycle starts again a few months later. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so, theoretically, it seems if you had a virus that once you had it, you're immune for life, would possibly theoretically be okay. But we know from a scientific perspective that's just unethical and historically does not work.
And we know that doesn't work from a very common virus that I know I had as a child with chickenpox, right? Many of us have had chickenpox over the years. Right? I know I did when I was like 5, and my brother had it, but that doesn't mean that it stops existing, right? The herd immunity doesn't work because we all have had chickenpox in our lives. The virus still persists, right? And this is why, how many years ago now, a vaccine was developed for chickenpox, and many of us now have had a chickenpox vaccine, especially a younger generation, right?
Well, sure. I mean, chickenpox is an interesting concept because as we get older in life, we suffer from shingles, which is the chickenpox virus. So you have to get further. You can get further inoculations for that. And one thing to remember even about vaccines is that first off, vaccines are not always 100% effective. The flu vaccine, historically, and we've got so much information on it. The flu vaccine is only 40 to 60% effective in protecting you. But that's important, and there's a lot of reasons for that: strain, you know, personality issues in terms of how your immune system is, and so on. But the thing with vaccines is that we all know that over time, many vaccines wane. Your protection from them decreases over time. So sometimes you need a booster. Sometimes you don't. So there's so many factors, and we still don't know with COVID yet in the vaccines whether it will, how long that immunity will last. Will we all need to be getting a booster every 5 years to keep it in bay? We don't know any of this.
Right. It's still up in the air. So we've got a few questions coming in, and so that we're going to open this up to either of you to answer, of course. But so someone's asking about, because when we talk about, you know, looking at our risks, right? We sort of like, if you're going to go into a situation and assess your risk, one of those things is to look at ventilation, right? So like, are you in an open airspace? Are you in a closed airspace? And somebody's asking, you know, could you comment on how the virus can or not interact when you're looking at air that's distributed through like a ventilation system or a distribution system?
Sure. I mean, Megan, I could do that, or you want to do something? I've been doing a lot of chatting. So.
Yeah, I mean, I can take my best swing at it. I don't know if I'll nail it, but I think obviously there is, of course, you can't say there's no chance of it spreading through air distribution, and especially if you're not refreshing the air regularly. But I think something that's important to consider with that is that you would have to have enough of the virus then sort of circulating in the air to then be transmitted either through the distribution system, or if it's just kind of recycling the same air. And then those virus particles would also have to then enter another human host in order to cause any damage. So I'm sure there is probably small opportunity for that to occur. But I think the largest risks are when you're just sort of in close proximity to another person who is actively infected, and you're talking perhaps without masks, maybe coughing, sneezing, and there's greater opportunity for the virus to spread that way. But there are certainly air filters and air filtration systems that will work to filter out pathogens and particles and dirt from recirculating in the air. So that would effectively reduce the risk if there were to be virus circulating in the air.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And there are guidelines on number of air changes per hour and things like that, special types of filters that need to be used in high traffic areas to make sure that you kind of minimize the ability for those viruses to circulate through the air.
I saw a question about the range of symptoms and how adolescents are affected and if teenagers can get a severe case. So I'd like to answer that one.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Teenagers absolutely can get a severe case of COVID. While we're seeing the patterns of sort of the older demographics, immunocompromised, pre-existing conditions seem to be taking a harder hit. Like I said earlier, that's not a hard and fast rule, and that doesn't mean simply because you're young and you're healthy, you're completely immune to the virus and you won't have a completely adverse response to it. I think in Manitoba right now, there's 30 people under the age of 50 that are hospitalized with COVID. They're in a really bad outbreak. And that's, I think, is a really important metric for everyone to acknowledge and process, that it can affect anyone, and it affects individuals very differently. And another big concern with COVID is we do not know the long-term effects of it. So getting a really severe case when you're an adolescent, teenager, early 20s, you might recover from it, but we don't know how that's going to affect you and your health throughout your lifespan. It's affecting various tissues, various organs, lots of respiratory issues, and we're seeing lots of cardiac issues as well. So that's a heavy burden to take for the rest of your life should you have the infection now when you're young.
And that's so a good lesson to always to do all the public health guidelines, right, and things like that, right? So we have one last question that's come in, and I think I'm not quite sure of this answer. I'm kind of like, oh, I don't know. Have we heard anything about how UV light and might affect how, whether it can kill the virus or not? And I've heard differing things, and I'm just kind of interested because you can buy the devices, right, that are like UV light. You throw your phone in there, your keys or whatever. And I don't know too much about them. I'm trying to figure out, have they been proven? Have they been, are they approved by, a government like Health Canada? Like, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, sure. I can take that. That's actually a good thing. I always want to leave on a note of, keep yourself safe. So, couple of things first. I'm going to back up one, talk a little bit about hand sanitizer, because there's always been this myth. And Perel, I don't know about this, but when this first hit, Perel got in trouble for stating that it could kill the virus. Perel itself does not kill the virus. It's an antibacterial, it's not an antiviral. So they changed their formula, and now you'll see that there are hand sanitizers, change the name, that include a high percentage of alcohol. And that helps disrupt the membrane and do other things. So it helps kill the virus. So just be careful that you think just using your hand shelf Perel to a certain degree, it'll kill the bacteria, great, but it really is ineffective in with viruses. So that leads us to other means of killing the virus externally. And we talked about hand washing being the most effective. Absolutely, UV light kills viruses. We've known that for a long period of time. And that's UV light and various different things are used in laboratory settings in a number of different ways. I won't get into it, but depending on how severe it is, it's a safety mechanism to help stop the release or the accidental release of viruses under laboratory conditions and things to this effect. So they do work. And in fact, there have been a number of entrepreneurs who have shown that, they've tried to make devices and things like that will kill things. They've turned a big dishwasher into a big UV light tanning pad kind of deal where you put your dishes in or anything that you need to sterilize from the virus in there, and they snap it for a certain period of time. The couple of things to remember is not all UV light's the same. There's different quality and things like that you have to take into consideration. So you have to be sure that you have the right quality of light. Secondly, it's somewhat difficult to employ, and if you have a shaded area, it doesn't get the UV light. It's ineffective. Every 360 degree of the surface must be exposed to the UV light to have it done. Ironically, I was actually in Asia when this outbreak occurred, and a lot of places were taking quick measures to try and do this. And I saw in some restaurants they had all of their plates, cutlery, and everything. As you went down a line or you're picking your food up, it all went through a UV device. So it is effective and it can be used. Is it practical and is it 100% effective? It really depends on a number of factors: quality of light, the amount of time, how much surface area you're seeing. So the short answer, yes, effective. Long answer, is it something that we can effectively use right now? Depends on the application. But you know what's better? Wash your hands.
Simple. Well, this has been such a great conversation. I'm going to open up. Megan and David, do you want to say your kind of last words? What would be your final message to people about what we've talked about today? Megan, I'll hand it over to you.
I guess my final message would be to, continue reading, always read the news, stay up to date on what's happening, and follow the public health guidelines 100%. Wash your hands, wear your mask, limit your outings, limit your social interactions, and do your best to kind of, play your part in limiting the spread. And hopefully, if everyone follows those rules, we can curb the case numbers a little bit before they spike too high.
Thanks, Megan. And David?
Yeah, thanks. One thing I really want to emphasize is that, and Megan kind of touched on this, is educate yourself about this, but educate yourself through the proper resources.
Yeah, not social media, unless it's informative talk like this one.
Unless it's from Science North and Laurentian University. Totally legit.
Thanks, Megan. I think that there's been a lot of damage done, and I think it's in fact dangerous that there's so much misinformation out there about this. People tend to tune into social media more than checking the CDC website or any other more proven source of information. It's vital that you get the right information. And I really enjoyed the questions that we've gotten from people because it shows some insight and it shows that they're thinking about this. They're not just it's going in one ear and out the other, where it's something we've begun to live with, but rather it really is important to keep everyone safe, just not yourself. And my second point is don't become complacent during this time period. We're seeing a second surge, and that was to be expected. And there's a number of factors for it, but one is we became a little bit, COVID fatigued and complacent, Everybody was expanding a little bit. You're only washing your hands. You forget a few times and nothing happens. So then it just kind of becomes habit again. So don't become complacent. We really need a really strong next 6 months to see how the vaccine will roll out and how we're going to become protected from it. But our numbers are soaring. It's concerning. So please just don't become complacent. Work through it. We're all in this together. And as Megan said, always follow your public health guidelines and be diligent in doing that. And stay safe, stay well.
They have our best interest in mind, right? Absolutely.
We do.
Yeah, there's a reason for those.
All the latest research that's out there. Well, thank you so much, David and Megan, for joining us today. I just want to say a big thank you from both organizations, from both Science North and Laurentian University. This series of Let's Talk About COVID-19 is super important to both of our organizations. We understand the need that there is misinformation out there, and we want to be a trusted source within our community and beyond for people to come and get up-to-date, really good, correct and not misinformation, but really good information that they can use for themselves. So, and I also want to have everybody know that we are continuing this series throughout November, December, and January. Our next session is on November 25th. It will be at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It is en français, and it is l'angoisse de se retrouver ensemble. So it's all about talking about anxiety and the anxiety that we've had throughout COVID and our mental health and well-being, but also the anxiety about coming back together. We're going to have a similar talk in English as well on December the 2nd at 9 o'clock in the morning. So you can join us in both languages, either on November 25th or on December 2nd. So we're super excited to continue this series, and you can look at both sciencenorth.ca and at Laurentian University's website to see what's coming up next. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day.